And in the light of this fact, it's quite useful to read the transcript of Pell's replies to the Royal Commission. And there's a few clips you can still see online where he says it wasn't of Ridsdale wasn't, his crimes were not, didn't strike me as important, or words to that effect, right? So what you see, it's really like a mobster seeing a mobster being questioned in court or by some investigative commission. You see arrogance, complete absence of any remorse, like real remorse, right? You have a sort of kind of shamefacedness, embarrassment, and guilt. Well, no, you don't see that in Pell, right? You see someone called it a couple of the people, victims, said he described him as showing sociopathic indifference, and that's what you see, right? He's arrogant, he's fighting, he's angry that he's questioned. He'll lie without the slightest qualm. His only limitation there is that he's got a lot of smart people questioning him at this point, and he's reasonably intelligent, but he's not an Einstein. He's more cunning than smart.
Thank you for joining me today. And my guest is John Lamont, and he's written extensively for Church Militant. People have a lot to say about Church Militant, but I think John fits into my opinion of Church Militant very well, because I've seen that they are willing to tackle a lot of difficult, tough issues that other Catholic media outlets aren't. And I see them they're not as ideological as some, which are specifically more liberal or more traditional. And what I liked about Church Militant is they were willing to take on abuse problems in the SSPX. They were willing to write very hard-hitting articles about the Fraternity of St. Peter and abuse issues that they've had. And that's when actually I first became aware of you, John, is your articles about the SSPX. And those were great. And Church Militant posted them. And I have to say, too, that I've talked to a lot of abuse survivors, and many have told me that, personally, they've told me that Church Militant was the only Catholic media outlet that was willing to listen to them and perhaps share their stories. So thank you for your work with Church Militant, John. And I encourage you to go read those articles about the SSPX. And you've also written a lot about Cardinal Pell, and that's why I'm talking to you today.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on. I guess I should explain how I came to
Please, thank you.
know a bit about Cardinal Pell, encounter him. So I'm an academic, not working as one any longer, but studied theology and philosophy here in Canada. I'm Canadian, and at Oxford University. Did a postdoc in theology at St. Andrews University in Scotland.
Wow.
Wrote, I was a Gifford Fellow there. I'll do a brief plug for this book, edited by me and Claudio Pierantoni, which is an attack on, it's defending the faith against present heresies. It's an attack on Pope Francis for his being a heretic and protecting pedophiles and so on and so forth.
Who's the publisher?
Aruka Press. And it has the distinction of having been taken off Amazon.com.
Why?
They wouldn't say.
Yeah.
My publisher wouldn't get an answer.
So where do people find it?
You can get it on Amazon sites outside the United States, and you can get it from the publisher Aruka Press.
Okay.
Yeah, so I wrote some of the stuff in there and edited and put it together.
I'll put a link in the video description when I post it.
Okay, oh, that'd be great. Yeah, and I've done a few more academic things. Here's my book written on faith and theology, basically. So finished my postdoc at St. Andrews University, I saw an ad for a theologian at the Sydney Seminary, and Cardinal Pell was then the Archbishop. I got hired there slightly on false pretenses because my licentiate supervisor, when I studied theology with the Dominicans, was Father Jean-Marie Roger Thiard, who was a well-known progressive pair at the Second Vatican Council. So I was hired under a bit of a misapprehension, went to work at the Sydney Seminary for 4 years, got to know, met Pell a few times, had to deal with a lot of his policies, got to know the setting of the church that he was in, and got to evaluate the man himself. And I guess I came to your attention when he was jailed for some time for sexually abusing some altar boys, supposedly. And I said, well, I think he's innocent. I think he was framed in this case. He shouldn't be in jail. It's a tragedy for the Australian justice system. But the man himself has a long history of covering up sexual abusers, and he deserves to be in jail.
Right.
So I guess that's what got your attention, and perhaps thought you'd like to talk to me about.
It did, yeah. John and I have gone back and forth on social media for quite a while, talking about the Pell case. My interest peaked, I have to say, when Cardinal Pell was released from prison, and John can talk more about this, after his conviction, I guess, for sexual assault. I think it was 2 boys. Was overturned by the Supreme Court in Australia. And in the Catholic blogosphere, I saw several people, and people that I knew and trusted, talk about Cardinal Pell as if he were a martyr, as if he were this Catholic hero, as if he were a saint. And I was like, let me dig a little deeper into his life, because I had just read what I saw about that particular case where he was charged with sexual assault and convicted, but then the conviction was overturned. So I did look at that, but then I wanted to dig a little deeper, and probably if there's an image that stuck in my mind, and I think I'm going to use it for the thumbnail for this video, it was a 1993 image of then auxiliary bishop Cardinal Pell, who accompanied predator priest Gerald Ridsdale to his court appearance, where Ridsdale was charged with 30 incidents of indecent assault involving nine boys aged between 12 and 16, where Ridsdale pleaded guilty. So that image stuck with me. This Archbishop accompanied a serial violent predator to court. I was like, what? Why? So that piqued my interest. So and then I guess I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I started reading a lot about Pell, his ecclesial history in the church, going back to when he was a priest in Ballarat, and you can talk more about that, which has become notorious in, I guess, Australian circles that know a lot about the history of abuse in the Australian church. And we haven't heard much about it in the United States. I mean, because the United States had its own, history of church abuse. And I think some people might have heard of Ireland was a big focal point for a lot of abuse, or it seemed that there was a lot of abuse took place there. But Australia as well.
Yes, it was.
Catholic...
It was appalling, and that's. I'd like to develop that a bit more.
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, what you get is you might get a bit of a lecture, which is what you do if you ask a
No, please.
former academic to talk. I think so. Do you understand George Pell, who's a significant figure in Australian history? You have to understand Australia and the Australian Church. So, Australia came into being as a result of America. So, there's a savage criminal law in Britain in the 18th century. As late as 1809, more than 600 crimes were punishable by death. Right. So juries were reluctant to convict someone to death, sentence someone to death for stealing a silver spoon or a feather bed. So they would tend to commute the sentence to transportation, which was first to America. But after the American Revolution, that didn't work. You couldn't send them there any longer. The prisons were filling up. There was a crisis. And so Sir Joseph Banks, the wealthy scientist who'd been to Australia with Captain Cook, stood up in Parliament. He bought himself a seat there, as you could in those days, and said, let's send the prisoners to Australia. So in 1788, the first fleet lands in Botany Bay, and it consists of a whole bunch of convicts and their guards. So Australia is essentially a penal colony right up until the 1850s, when there's a gold rush there. And after that, transportation doesn't work because people want to go there. They think they'll be mining gold. And it was an extremely violent colony, extremely brutal prison regime. And the Catholics were at the bottom of the pile. So many of the first convicts were Catholics who'd stolen something to eat or something, or were Irish political prisoners who weren't criminals at all. And the local magistrates, so you arrive there, you'd have to work for someone for either on a farm or just as a servant, essentially a slave for a local magistrate for 10 years. Then you could be sent off, then you'd just be turned loose. The local magistrates were Anglicans. There's a notorious Anglican minister called the flogging parson, Samuel Marsden, who would send its men to hundreds of lashes with the cat o' nine tails, which could easily kill you, right? And he was especially hard on Catholics. So you had this, who were 30% of the prison population. I mean, give you an example. Here's a story of a Tasmanian ghost. In 1834, on a well-known property at Campbelltown in Tasmania, a butler dropped a silver tray containing china. For this misdemeanor, he was flogged to death.
Wow.
Each year, on the anniversary of his demise, it is said, you can hear the crash of the dropped tray.
Ooh.
So, yeah, it was an appalling, brutal regime where Catholics were mistreated, and they were largely Irish. So you had a poor, severely oppressed Irish population that formed the heart of the Catholic Church there. They did start off with a very saintly bishop called Bede Polding, and his idea was that you would start, who's an English Benedictine. His idea is that you would start Benedictine monasteries all over the country and evangelize and the country is for Catholics in that way. But he was English, the Catholics were Irish. The sort of Jesuits got in, and his quite sound plan was all dumped. So it was a Irish Catholic, very tribal, very downtrodden church, which had the fierce loyalties that you once would have had in the Irish Church in the United States. So in the First World War, it was actually exacerbated because the Archbishop Mannix, the Archbishop of Melbourne, one of the two main cities, resisted conscription because he was Irish. He didn't want people to have to go and fight for the British Empire. Everyone else bitterly resented this. Prejudice and discrimination against Catholics took an upturn. You had ads saying no Catholics need to apply for jobs right into the 1950s. And so Australia was founded in the Enlightenment. Early religious figures like the Reverend Marsden weren't very inspiring spiritual leaders. And so aside from the Catholics, it was a very secular state, right? Heavily dominated by Freemasons who wouldn't give Catholics jobs. The new capital city, Canberra, was actually designed by a pair of occultists called Walter and Mary and Bertie Griffin. So if you look at the map, it's all these funny loops and lines, and it's a real pain to get around. It's terrible city planning, but it was all done to support their sort of strange occult symbolism of taken from theosophy. So it's a very hostile environment.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
That's a church that Pell grew up in.
Can I interrupt you really quick?
Yeah.
Because I think what you're saying is important, because I didn't know.
But it's too late.
Yeah. I didn't know this, what you're talking about, because it sounds like Catholicism in a lot of countries, especially the New World, they're a minority. So I think Catholics tended to huddle into those communities, protect each other. And I think you can have a problem where those communities can become secretive.
Yeah. Here in Canada, it was two minorities that hated each other, the English and the French. But it worked the same way.
So would you say
the Irish and the French? Yeah.
So would you say my assumption is kind of correct, that that's the milieu? Okay.
Yeah. And also something you had in Ireland itself, which is often the priests were the only educated men.
Yes.
So they're the ones you relied on in dealing with authority.
Yes.
And you were a very poor Catholic with a large family and no education, right? You depended on your priests in secular matters as well as religious ones.
And in that culture, there's a very profound respect for the clergy. And because I was raised sort of by Irish priests here in California, and it was at the tail end of sort of that immigration. Now it's completely gone. But in those big Irish families, it's like everybody had a brother that was a priest.
Yeah.
So it was a community. And certainly in Australia, people would have huddled into those communities around the church, which isn't a bad thing, because it's those communities supported people like you talked about, but it can also be toxic, because then if something goes wrong, they tend to try to keep it in-house. And I think when you look at Pell's reaction to abuse, I think, but not just him, I think most priests and bishops tried to do, let's keep it in the family, so to speak.
Okay, that's true, but I think actually Pell was a man of a later period.
Okay.
Right? So I'll explain that a bit. Just talk about his career. So he's born in 1941.
Right.
His father is a former heavyweight boxer who keeps a pub in Ballarat and keeps books on the side. It's said that it was not a rough pub, but I don't actually believe that. No. So he was an excellent athlete. He was very good. He was signed to play professional Australian rules football.
Was he working class? He was working class boy.
Yeah. No, I guess his dad owned the pub, right? But he wasn't like a professional or
right.
He would have been well off working class, and he run the kind of people you deal with if you keep a book on the side, right? That if you have an illicit betting business. So he's an excellent athlete, got an education and got ahead through the church. Right? So he went to Christian Brothers School in Ballarat, St. Patrick's College, which you can hear about in other contexts.
A lot of problems.
Yes, yeah. He's picked as a bright young guy by the bishop. He's sent to Rome.
Yeah.
Ordained. When he's ordained, I think he's ordained in 1961. sent to Rome in the heady days of the Second Vatican Council, writes a dissertation there praising Teilhard de Chardin, the crackpot French
Really?
modernist
Okay.
fascist. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what he did to get ahead. Then he's sent to Oxford to do a doctorate.
He knew how to play. He knew how to play the game then, even then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I find it interesting, John. Sorry to interrupt you. I find it interesting, John, how, because I've heard this in the history of other bishops or other cardinals, that they're often singled out very early on and promoted. I find that interesting how that process works.
Well, it's you have your clan, right? So you want to have guys, you want a town spot for your clan and your guys. So then he's sent to Oxford, where he writes a doctorate. Perhaps he gets a bit of help with it, but he does get an Oxford doctorate. I guess he passed the Viva. Gets to Oxford, goes back to Ballarat, right? And I think the Diocese of Ballarat is important to understand him. So it's an old gold mine town in Victoria. It's a beautiful place, has some beautiful buildings from the old gold mining days. There's a nice pilgrimage there, Ballarat to Bendigo, that I've walked a few times. So he goes to Ballarat, just a quick sketch of his career, goes to Ballarat, stays there till 1973, 1985. Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne, 1987.
Right.
Archbishop of Melbourne, 1996. The Bishop of Sydney, 2001. So, as I say, I think Ballarat is essential to understanding him, right? So
can I say a little bit something about that?
Yeah.
Because I'll just go through my research of him. So that he first came, Cardinal Pell first came on the radar in terms of Ballarat. Yeah, that the name of that town is notorious in terms of the sex abuse scandal in Australia. So in 1974, a teenage boy complained to then, I guess it was then Father Pell, that a Christian brother by the name of Edward Dowland at St. Patrick's College in Ballarat was misbehaving with boys. And Pell said, "I didn't do anything about it. The boy wasn't asking me to do anything about it."
It's a crime, right? It was civil and canonical. So,
well, it's just moral too. It's sort of bizarre that he brushed it off. I don't want to say, I'm sorry, I don't want to say brushed it off. I don't know how, but he didn't. He in 1974, so that's fairly early in his priesthood. He was made aware of problems. And he didn't do anything. So sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Ballarat, at least 14 priests of the diocese have actually been credibly accused or convicted of sexual abuse. That's the diocesan priests, not the religious. And it's hard to convict in these cases, so I would multiply the actual abusers by a considerable figure. 853 children were sexually abused by Christian brothers in the schools in Ballarat.
Unbelievable.
At least 30 of them have committed suicide as a result.
30?
Yeah. From the schools, not the diocese.
Okay. Just a real quick thing about this particular priest, Dowland, the Christian brother. He later pleaded guilty to 33 counts of indecently assaulting boys under the age of 16.
Yeah, and in various horrible ways, right? I won't go into the details, but I think the main thing is that the Diocese of Ballarat was really a criminal organization disguised as a religious one.
And that was primarily a working class town.
Well, as much as anywhere in Australia is, it was fairly well off. The Catholics were working class because that's what they were in those days, right? Yeah. So Pell is the smart man. He's very politically adept. He's a man of ambition, right? His big idea, I think, was to get the big job in Rome, not Pope somewhere high up in Rome, from the pub in Ballarat. So he would have figured out quite early on, this is the character of the organization I'm in, and this is what I got to do to get ahead in it.
Which is what?
Right? Well, you have to. You can't start going around. You can't start going around exposing priestly sex abusers.
You can't be.
Right? You have to protect. You protect them when required, and B, you use your knowledge to get ahead. Right? So that gets us to Gerald Ridsdale, who was probably, I'm sure he's the guy in the picture you're referring to.
That was one of the first pictures that showed up on my radar of a young Pell accompanying from 1993, accompanying Gerald Ridsdale. He's probably the worst serial molester of the Catholic Church in Australia.
I would say he's the worst. As far as we know, he's the worst of the worst.
Okay.
Right?
I mean, I don't want to say, I would say worst in terms of the quantity of children that he abused. So
yeah, the intensity was, I guess, pretty.
And the sadistic, and the sadistic nature of the abuse, yeah.
So Pell lived with him for a while, 1973. There's actually gossip in the pubs about him at that early point. Australia had a useful royal commission into sexual cover-up of sexual abuse by institutions that you can find online, and that will give you a lot of the details about that. So the Royal Commission said Pell probably knew at this time about the guy's abuse. Ridsdale just goes on and abuses huge numbers of people. Pell becomes one of the College of Consultors, a priest who advises the bishops, Ronald Mulcairns of Ballarat. He's at a meeting where Mulcairn said, look, what are we going to do with this guy? He's abusing all these people. Let's send him to Sydney. Right? And Pell denies that he heard anything about Ridsdale's abuse at that meeting. Again, not a denial, not found credible by the Royal Commission. Right? So finally, I think Ridsdale, leaves any ministry. I don't know, he's in by 1988. 1993, as it often is with these appalling offenders, there's just a blizzard of victims, right? I think he's convicted for abusing 68 different people in the end. So he's put on trial. Pell goes with him to the court, right? Allegedly so Pell says, and by that time he's the auxiliary bishop of Melbourne. So what is he's in Melbourne, right? What is he doing going with Ridsdale from Ballarat to a court appearance for 33 offenses? My belief is that he was doing that to send a message, right? So Ridsdale is the worst of the worst. He sent them the message, okay, I'll protect you, right? I'll protect anyone if they do what I want, right? And that's I mean, this is my hypothesis, but he's not an idiot. He wouldn't do that in that case unless he wanted to send a message about his presence with Ridsdale. Yeah. I even wonder why he was photographed there and the photograph became public.
Pell once said this about Ridsdale: he has done a great damage to the church, but as a priest, he had done other good things.
I don't know. Like, I don't know. It was just one of the lines you come up with, right? I don't think you don't want to necessarily read too much into what these people like Pell say in these situations. So I even think, so auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, right? I think that's why he was doing it. That was one of his tactics for moving ahead in this criminal organization.
Yeah,
because he knew that he knew that pedophiles are either running it or have a veto on everything that goes on. So if he'll if he'll go to bat for them for this guy, then he has a lever to get them to get on his side.
Yeah, let me say this. Ridsdale was convicted of child sex abuse and indecent assault against 65 children aged as young as 4 years old. Pell later admitted, this is a quote, "I did hear rumors about the time Ridsdale returned from treatment in the US in 1990. So he did admit that in 1990 he knew. And can I just point out what I thought was a bit of hypocrisy in the Catholic space, especially among traditionals. Cardinal Kevin Farrell was also lived with Cardinal McCarrick for a time. And Farrell, after all of the abuse of Cardinal McCarrick, was asked, did you know anything about McCarrick? And he said, no, I absolutely did not. And a lot of Catholics in traditional circles were rightly very suspicious of that statement. But I mean, now that the shoe is on the other foot, Pell also lived not as long as McCarrick and Farrell were living together, but Pell did live with a serial pedophile, and he claimed to not know anything about it.
Yeah, and someone who's much more blatant and much less smart than McCarrick, right? Yeah. So
that's a double standard there. So
yeah, so I think that's what he did. I think that was his strategy. It's funny. At the same time, he was saying genuinely Catholic things in the 1980s that got him in trouble. I think he does have some kind of faith of a sort, some kind of convictions of a sort, but they're not ones. He's not like a Whirl or McCarrick, who's just in it for the power and the perverse gratification. But they weren't convictions that were allowed to get in the way of his advancement. And in some respects, they weren't bad convictions to abortion is murder or something. They weren't bad convictions to express in the pontificate of John Paul II.
Can you talk a little bit, just sticking with the Ridsdale case, because it's the most heinous. Did you know anything about I don't want to say his name, the nephew, although it's public knowledge, the nephew of Gerald Ridsdale, who he claims that his uncle Gerald Ridsdale molested him, and he claims that he went to Cardinal Pell and told him.
Yes. Okay, there's that's part of another more complex, illuminating story that I might tell it and weave it in. So Pell becomes Archbishop of Melbourne, right? Probably the biggest Catholic city. Melbourne and Sydney, the two rival cities, two rival Catholic sees. Overwhelmingly the two big Catholic centers in Australia. So he's Archbishop of Melbourne. This is a huge promotion. Right? So a seminarian at the Melbourne Seminary it's John Roach, I believe, comes to him and said, "Oh, this priest, John Walsh, got me drunk and molested me." Right. So he says, "Oh, okay, I'll deal with it." The guy goes, this molested seminarian goes away, does nothing. John Walsh, Pell ends up putting in as he lives with him for a while as well. Then he ends up putting him in as parish priest in one of the wealthiest parishes in Melbourne, right? And why? It's because he knows I got something on this guy, so now he's going to be my man. And Walsh delivered on that much later when the Pell was being questioned by the Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse in 2016. David Ridsdale comes up and says, "Okay, I was molested by my Uncle Gerald. I talked to Pell. Pell offered to bribe me to shut me up."
Yeah.
Right. So then John Walsh, Pell, I think he got his secretary, Michael Casey, poor miserable little man, to call up Walsh and say, look, can you testify for me at the Royal Commission and say that you were in the room when I was talking to David Ridsdale, and I never attempted to bribe him. So Walsh does that. He testifies, doesn't hold up under cross-examination very well. After that, John Roach sees him and says, like, this is the guy who molested me. And he contacts the media. At this point, Walsh, I think I might have met at some point, is ejected from being the parish priest. So that's how it's interesting to see. That's how these maneuvers work.
Okay, John, can you backtrack really quick? I know what the Royal Commission is, but the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in Australia was so egregious that the Australian government formed this Royal Commission. It's kind of like the Pennsylvania grand jury report that was in the United States and Pennsylvania, but it was the entire country. So could you just describe a little bit about what the Royal Commission was, if you could? Thank you.
Well, it was a Royal Commission is a commission of inquiry set up by the government. It has the power to call witnesses, get them to testify under an oath. It wasn't just into the Catholics. They did institutions. They certainly did the Anglicans and maybe some secular institutions as well. Certainly the Catholic crimes and testimonies were by far the more lurid and evil and spectacular. The material has now been put on all on the internet, so you can read the cross-examination of Walsh, of Pell. It's an excellent source. I mean, if there's a shortcoming, it's that I think a lot of these religious figures only got away with it because they had a fair bit of cover they had buddies in pedophile circles in the cops and the local government, right? And that doesn't come out so much in the Royal Commission. You've seen it in the case, to say why, I might explain a bit why I think that. There's a town called Wollongong, south of Australia, right? A very popular mayor called Frank Arkell.
South of Australia or south of what, Sydney?
No, sorry, south of Sydney, just south of Sydney.
Okay.
Very beautiful place. I've been there to go to the beach. Had a mayor called Frank Arkell. He was bludgeoned to death by a Satanist. And after this happened, came out that he was a terrible predatory pedophile, and he and the network of local police and local Catholic priests had all been in on the game. So in Wollongong, you see a bit of the whole network. The Royal Commission, there's not so much of the government as the police as there might be, but it's very good on the Catholic Church. So Pell is being questioned by the Royal Commission about Ridsdale, and he gets Walsh to come, and Ridsdale's nephew, and he gets Walsh to come and say, no, Pell didn't offer Gerald Ridsdale's nephew a bribe.
Yeah.
I was listening.
Yeah.
And Walsh's defense of Pell breaks down under cross-examination, doesn't look very plausible. Then after it's made public, the guy, John Roach, who Walsh abused, says, well, that guy abused me. I went to Cardinal Pell about it. What is he doing defending Pell? Exposes the whole story. Walsh quits under duress. So that's a good insight in how it works and how Pell works.
Okay. I just wanted to give you another quote here. Now, this was when Pell was asked much later about his presence at the court with Ridsdale and that infamous photograph. Pell said, quote, "He was a brother priest who made terrible mistakes, and it was simply a gesture on my part," unquote. In 2013, Pell admitted that his presence with Ridsdale was a mistake. He said, "I realized that was a mistake. I've always been on the side of victims." I want to look at that. I want to look at that quote, mistake. Okay. I think the Catholic Church should demand accountability from priests, but certainly from bishops, archbishops, and cardinals. I kind of compare this to when Francis Bergoglio was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, and he was asked about sex abuse in Buenos Aires, and he said, I have no predator priests. Yeah. So it's kind of like, how are these bishops chosen? Because like you said, that early on, Pell was picked out to rise in the ranks. But I think, I mean, he should not have risen any further after this, because that's a super lapse in judgment, that 1993 accompaniment with a serial child molester to court.
And what about his brother Catholics who were the 33 victims?
I mean, what? Gosh, it's tone deaf. There's a lot of tone deafness. I mean, Bergoglio, in that conclave, they should have passed up Bergoglio. He says there's no predator priests. And he was elected at a time when the sex abuse crisis was very much on the forefront. I know a lot of Catholics have tried to put it on the back burner, but and the same thing with Pell. After that 1993 photograph, why wasn't he? I'm asking you to foretell the future. You can't do that, but that's
it's because the whole setup is unbelievably corrupt. And Melbourne, so Ballarat is really a criminal organization. I think Melbourne is too big to just be described, Archdiocese of Melbourne, too big to be described as just a criminal organization. But it certainly has large amounts of influential pedophiles, did and does have them in its clergy. And they would have, if not control, at least a lock, a veto on what goes on there.
Yeah.
So Pell's predecessor, Frank Little, Precious Little, as they used to call him, he protected the most appalling people. I remember I was teaching my seminarians when he died. So I came in and I said, well, hell's heating bills have just gone up very substantially. And they looked at me and said, well, Frank Little, Archbishop of Melbourne, just died. Here are the pedophile priests that he protects. This guy, this guy, this guy, this guy.
I want to say something.
That was really good for my career.
I want to say something about Ridsdale, because I think people need to know. Ridsdale assaulted victims in toilet stalls, showers, and even in the confessional. He allegedly carried a jar of Vaseline in his car where he assaulted a boy. Another victim had to undergo anal surgery after he was sodomized by Ridsdale. I think people need to know this, what kind of demons that they're dealing with. And you know what? A lot of Catholics, I won't say a lot, I'll say a number of Catholics have used this excuse with me. Well, the 1970s, even the 1990s, that was before, the Dallas Charter in 2002. That's before Boston. That's before, we knew that all this stuff, whatever. I kind of thought that the Nuremberg trials had kind of settled some of this, because some of the Nazi, I don't want to stretch this comparison, but some of the Nazis were like, well, that was the times, that's what was going on. That's what I was told to do. But I mean, I thought the Nuremberg trials was about, there's just a set of morality in humanity, like genocide, that is just wrong. And I would think that the child molestation is another one of those. So
and even faith. If you have Catholic faith, that's a terrible crime. You don't actually have to look it up in this civil code of law or the code of canon law, which during all that period said it was a terrible crime to know that.
I can't move beyond that 1974 incident where a young man, that must have been very difficult for that young man to go to then Father Pell and talk about the abuse, and Pell said, I didn't do anything about it.
Yeah. Who knows if some of the at least 30 boys who later committed suicide might not have said the same thing to him and aren't here to record it, right? That's a lot of suicides. I think there's a lot more than that. And it's not a big town. I think it has population of 100,000 or something like that. Ballarat. It's not a metropolis.
Okay. In 1996, Pell was appointed the Archbishop of Melbourne, and he served as auxiliary from 1987 to 1996. And in an effort to address the growing problem of sexual abuse by priests, Archbishop Pell created the so-called Melbourne Response. Can you talk a little bit about? Okay.
Okay. So what he did was, it's allegedly some protocol, right?
Right.
So what you do is, if you've been sexually abused by the church, you go to that church. They send you to this alleged independent commissioner. If this independent commissioner, who has ties to the church, as it happens, this independent commissioner judges if your story is plausible or not. And if it is plausible, the independent commissioner is empowered to offer you compensation up to a top limit of $50,000 Australian.
Correct.
Right. And in return for that, you sign some sort of release. It seems to have some sort of general broad confidentiality.
It's kind of like an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah, and of course, there's a number of things to be said about that, right? One is that if you've been anally raped and had to have surgery by a priest, $50,000 isn't going to pay for all the damage to your life.
Well, not the pain and suffering, nor the psychological abuse. If you're seeking out psychological help.
Yeah, right. And I'm sure it was a figure worked out by actuaries. Okay, this is what we can afford, right? There's no provision in this for the church to report criminal abuse to the civil authorities, and it's often forgotten that there's a canon in canon law that says priests who are guilty of these crimes are to be tried and punished. And there's no provision for, and which never happened. I think never happened at all, in complete violation of the law of the church from about the 1960s on.
And in the 1990s, within the Catholic Church space, this Melbourne response was really heralded as being, very, future thinking, because really the crisis had not hit, certainly the United States by then, but it hadn't hit the world. So Pell was congratulated on his forethought. Now by
all the other bishops who thought this was a great idea to limit our liability, squash victims, stop them from. Yeah.
But the narrative was even switched, like this was such a compassionate thing that he did, this Melbourne.
Yeah.
So I read a lot of it. The Melbourne response included this admonition. This is from it. Okay. I'm putting this quote. Complainants remain free to use the normal court process if they do not wish to avail themselves of the compensation panel process. In that event, they should expect that the proceedings will continue to be strenuously defended.
Yeah.
Any claimant coming before the panel will be informed of their right to refuse the ex gratia payment being offered and to pursue their claim in the civil courts. They will also be informed that the Archbishop and the Archdiocese will continue to defend claims in the courts on all bases.
And this is for complainants who are accepted as having had a plausible case.
Strenuously defended. That's not a scare tactic. That's not saying to an abuse survivor, don't go this route.
And this is what Pell did, right? In the notorious case of John Ellis. So this was a guy, he was, what was his name? Who's the guy, the priest who abused him? It was, who abused Ellis? So he's abused by Father Adrian Duggan, right? So he went to Pell and said, okay, I was abused. It's had a terrible cost in my life and my marriage. It's been caused, this is the list of all the dreadful things that have happened to me as a result. I'd like, and it's harmed my wife too. So here's what I'd like. I'd like $50,000 for me. That's a top amount from your Melbourne plan. $50,000 for my wife, who's also suffered, and an apology. It's looked into.
That's reasonable.
They judged, and and it's very reasonable. It's looked into. They judged that Ellis actually was abused by this guy, right? But they say, and Pell knew about this judgment, and they say, no, sorry, you can have 25,000. And he says, what? So he says no, takes it to the civil court because he's a lawyer. Eventually, there's a very unfortunate landmark case in which the church spends $1.5 million defending against him, to the extent that their insurer, who usually pays all the bills, not them, doesn't come out of George Pell's pocket, writes to them saying we have serious concerns about the amount of money being spent on this case. It goes to the court, and which in a landmark, very unfortunate decision says, okay, well, no, the Catholic Church, this archdiocese, is an illegal body. You can't sue it. The trustees have the money. They have no decisions over the disciplining or appointing of priests. The archbishop at the time of your abuse is no longer the archbishop. There's no one you can sue. So in the course of this, Pell and his lawyers, although they know and have in internal documents admitted that Ellis was abused, instruct the lawyers to maintain that no abuse occurred. Ellis is aggressively questioned to try to show that he's a liar. He has sort of further very severe breakdowns. He can't work any longer. And then they go after him after he loses the case finally on this grounds that aren't very satisfying in terms of natural justice. They go after him for their court costs.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's compassionate.
Yeah. And I mean, you see, so you have a pattern with Pell from 1973, all through 1974 with the Dallin guy, poor kid abused by that guy. Melbourne Response. I think there's some cases in Melbourne where he was brutal to some abuse victims. Ellis and Sydney, and that was going on sort of, I think, almost when I was there, right? And it was only finally resolved when all came out in the Royal Commission. Pell denies that he knew that Ellis had been judged to be actually abused by the church process itself, right?
Yeah.
And he says, "Oh, I didn't know." And he says, "I didn't know about getting costs from Ellis in the case and the Royal Commission said, "Okay, you're not credible."
Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything in the Catholic Church. The one thing, and I've had experience with this, the one thing that you can rely upon is when a scandal breaks into the public, they didn't know. They didn't know.
Yeah.
So one case that really bothered me well, they all bothered me, but one that really bothered me in the Melbourne Response was, into the investigation of the Melbourne Response by the Royal Commission, was there was one case, even though Cardinal Pell testified that, quote, I had no reason to doubt, unquote, the validity of a particular victim's abuse claim. The victim received a letter from the Archdiocese stating that, quote, a realistic alternative to litigation that will otherwise be strenuously defended. They believed that the abuse took place, but they told this survivor that if they sought compensation outside of these commissions and panels within the church, that it would be strenuously defended, the priest.
And it was true. And Ellis, that was Pell's point. And my guess is that he defended it. He spent the $1.5 million because he knew Ellis was telling the truth and been abused, right? People who lie about being abused aren't that hard to deal with. You can break them down, pay them off a bit of money. You can break them down in cross-examination in court, right?
And
it's people who are really having abuse that are the threat. They're the ones you have to psychologically crush and destroy and break financially.
I like that. I don't like it, but I think it's apt that you use the word threat, because I think these are threatening, especially to a survivor, because it's going to be difficult enough for them to come forward, but then to have to come forward and have to defend themselves because the machinery behind the Archdiocese is going to move against you.
Yeah. So, and actually, this machinery and the leaders like Pell, they'll look at the life history of the victim, and they'll try to assess their psychological weaknesses. They'll have an idea of the psychological weaknesses of such victims in general, and they'll try to assess the weaknesses of those victims in particular, and they'll use that as a line of attack in the court case. That's what they did with Ellis, and it worked.
And to show you that this tactic is not dead, it made headlines. That was just done in a case in Poland, where the young boy, the minor, was asked about his sexual orientation. The diocese was digging into that. And then recently I heard the testimony from another survivor, a male survivor, who said much the same thing, that the church, the diocese, whoever, the bishop, was digging into his past, his past sexual life.
Yeah, and in the light of this fact, it's quite useful to read the transcript of Pell's replies to the Royal Commission. And there's a few clips you can still see online where he says Ridsdale his crimes didn't strike me as important, or words to that effect, right? So what you see, it's really like a mobster seeing a mobster being questioned in court or by some investigative commission. You see arrogance, complete absence of any remorse, like real remorse, right? You have a sort of kind of shamefacedness, embarrassment, and guilt. Well, no, you don't see that in Pell, right? You see someone called it a couple of the victims said he described him as showing sociopathic indifference. And that's what you see, right? He's arrogant, he's fighting, he's angry that he's questioned. He'll lie without the slightest qualm. His only limitation there is that he's got a lot of smart people questioning him at this point, and he's reasonably intelligent, but he's not an Einstein. He's more cunning than smart. So that's what you see in Pell, and that's the kind of guy all these people, Catholics, are defending.
Yeah, the Royal Commission also found, quote, that the application for compensation form from the Melbourne Response is ambiguous. It could be read as imposing broad undertakings of confidentiality upon the victims, unquote. The Royal Commission finally found this is a scheme that is heavily dominated by lawyers and traditional legal process. By lawyers, and traditional legal process is unlikely to provide the most supportive environment for complainants.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair to the lawyers and the law, right? I think the law does have the mechanisms for achieving some kind of justice, if you, as you would find, if you, what are the standard, what are the standard amounts that are thought as suitable for compensation for the sorts of offenses that have been committed in a civil case. If you looked at those standard legal principles, you would find something much more favorable to the victims than you would get from the Melbourne process.
Yeah. So just digging a little, just looking at the Melbourne response a little closer, this thing, this shiny object that's held up as evidence that Pell was very much ahead of the game in terms of the church's response to priest abuse, and it was this empathetic and compassionate, process, isn't true. It was,
No,
I
no,
think,
it's
it
it's a
intimidated.
line that was trotted out to people who aren't going to look into what the Melbourne response was.
Yeah. I think it intimidated victims. It tried to shut them up, and it tried to protect church assets rather than do the right thing. What do you think about that?
Yeah. No, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's the whole point. That's the whole point.
Why this I know why this disconnect among more traditionally minded Catholics. I think they're so starved for a Catholic hero, somebody they can look up to, that they've canonized Pell.
Yeah, and also Australia is a long way away. They don't know much about him. They can fall in, they can sort of believe his PR and so on and so forth. Something that bothers me.
Sorry, can I bring something up really quick? I don't mean to interrupt you. This is a meme that I've heard in terms of Pell, and this is how there's a cult mentality in Roman Catholicism. They say, certain people say that because Pell was involved in this investigation into the Vatican Bank, that all of this stuff, all of it's made up. It's all made up. It's a conspiracy to get back at him.
Well, that's what people say on the internet. I think he got in too deep with the Vatican Bank. I think he thought he could sup with Jack Ketch, deal with the Bergoglio, who's even more, he's actually far more ruthless and corrupt than Pell is. Yeah. Pell has some human traits, right? I mean, I've been being very straightforward about his evil side, but he's not like the Pope, devoid of any real humanity, or hasn't destroyed his entire humanity.
Wow.
And maybe the Victorian police and the witnesses were all bribed to try to put Pell in jail by Cardinal Pell or whoever it was, his opponents in the Vatican. That may well be true. It may just have been hatred of Pell, homegrown hatred of Pell, wanting to claim his scalp. I don't know, but it has nothing to do with the whole history of his career as a bishop. And if you're in Australia, you need to look at what that history meant. So he was for a long time the kingmaker of the Australian Church. He decided on the bishop's appointments because he was John Paul II's man there, right? Uh-huh. And so that made him really the gravedigger of the Australian Church, because perhaps there weren't a whole lot of Orthodox strong candidates that could have been made to the episcopate. But he tried to get guys who were his men. So they were men who weren't sort of leaders or men of principle. They were ones who would do his will. And those are the clowns that they have in charge there now. I don't know. I mean, there's one or two good guys, but he could, with his king-making powers, have rejuvenated the Australian Church. He didn't.
I think another point that needs to be made too is why I think there's been so many defenders of Pell among more neocon or traditional Catholics is because Pell was seen as more traditional. He defended the right to life. He said some things that were against, the LGBT agenda. So I think by a lot of traditionalists, he was considered a good guy. As opposed to, I don't know, Kupich or somebody like that, who's more a blatant liberal. And I think more traditionally minded Catholics would be willing to believe a lot of things about Kupich. But with Pell, it was kind of like, no, he's one of the good guys. But I think, and I think I kind of had that mindset too, where it's kind of, and I think that's why your work on the SSPX is so important, because I kind of had that mindset. Okay, Latin Mass, a Latin Mass liturgy, the priests, the bishops that are favorable towards the Latin Mass, that's safe. They're untouched by this pervasive and systematic, abuse in the Catholic Church. But I think Pell is one of those cases that proves that wrong. That it's hit everyone.
Although to be fair, he's not a traditionalist, right? He's a JP2 neoconservative.
Okay.
He was willing to make generous provisions for traditionalists to hear the Latin Mass in Sydney. I was one of those people, but he didn't believe in it. I remember the traditionalists, the Society of St. Peter Parish there gave a parish dinner, and they invited him to speak. He thought he'd go there. He was going to read. He thought he'd have some old guys listening to his erudite paper with money, listening to his erudite paper on the liturgy. In fact, there were 400 people there. It was full of young people, and he just threw away his prepared speech and went on a long rant on how terrible it was in the old days and how it was a good idea to get rid of the old liturgy, right? So he's not a traditionalist. He did have some time for some people who weren't
but he did tolerate he tolerated the old Mass.
Well, I think he had some time for the people who supported it, right? I mean, he's really like an old Irish gangster.
But to traditionalists, those scraps are precious because I'm here in the Bay Area, and for the longest time, there was no access to the traditional Mass. So when a bishop finally said, "Oh, okay," that was a big deal. So, and you were very esteemed amongst a lot of traditionalists,
And this is a psychology people have been beaten down for 40 years, right? Any scrap seems wonderful.
And you don't want to look at those former heroes. You don't want to take an unbiased look. And I just see Catholics, especially with Pell, do not want to take an unbiased look at the evidence.
Look, and something that surprises me is look at Archbishop Vigano, right? From what I know about him, he actually is a genuine leader who's worth following. But why aren't they following him instead of Pell?
Well,
I don't get it. I mean, I guess that'd be hard. It would be no joke. You'd have to actually fight superior enemies. And Pell was he was a bruiser, right? He was someone you thought would stand up and fight for you. And in many cases, he did. Like for some people, he did.
Yeah. I want to get your response to something. Let's see. So this is from Ignatius Press, which is an American publishing company. They used to print a lot of things from Pope. I guess they still do, from Pope Benedict. Hans von Balthasar, I know they've printed a lot of his things.
Yeah, he was a terrible heretic, but go on, yes.
So this is the Cardinal George Pell Donation Project, and this went up very soon after Pell was released from prison, after that conviction was overturned. So Cardinal Pell is now out of jail and back in action, but he has the ongoing challenge of meeting the many legal expenses which were necessary to right the terrible injustice done to him. One way of doing this is to publish his story. So Ignatius Press, under Father Fessio, whose picture you see here, has published these journals that Pell wrote during his time in prison. This was kind of extraordinary here. So they say of the journals, I think it's, or Fessio, the Jesuit priest, I think it's going to be a spiritual classic. And he goes on, this is not just about Cardinal Pell. His victory was not just a victory for one man, it was a victory for the church. And not just the church in Australia, it revealed to all the world just how far the church's enemies will go and how deceitful they will be to discredit her.
This assumes that the story about the
Wow.
witnesses and the police being bought by the Cardinal and the Vatican is false. In which case, it isn't the church's enemies, but
I wonder how some of the victims in Australia feel about that. Deceitful. Because in the beginning, when we started this conversation, this is more than about that case with Cardinal Pell, which was overturned. This is also about his handling of sex abuse claims.
yeah, because that's why the jury wanted to find him. They just thought this guy should go down, and we don't care that much about the evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that.
Oh, I think he was convicted after the Royal Commission stuff came out. I think there's enough people on the jury who thought, okay, we don't care.
Yeah, I mean, that's why there was so much hatred for cardinal law after the Gagan case was made. I think it was the same kind of circumstances there in Boston, where they got him out of the United States very quickly, and he was sent, because the Gagan case was so heinous.
Although there is this to be said for, I mean, Fessio wrote that blurb about the enemies of the church, blah 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 blah, and he wants to sell his books, right? There is to be this to be said about Cardinal Pell. He's the only bishop, or let alone cardinal, I know of, who's actually had to do hard time for something connected to child sex abuse.
Right.
And he should have done hard time for what he did in shafting all these victims, because that was a crime he committed, and that would have been a more useful deterrent, right? But at least he did do a bit of hard time.
Yeah, and what he didn't do for victims, which was report the crimes.
Yeah. It wasn't enough hard time for the things that he did, but he did do something which no one else has.
Yeah, I wanted to get the problem of abuse, though, is so pervasive in the church. I'm gonna try to play this, but I don't want to put it on the video because I'm worried about copyright. So this is a quote from Pell, and it shocked me. Let me play it really quick. Let me see if I can play it. I'll play it without the video. I'll just play the audio.
I couldn't say that I ever knew that everyone knew. I knew a number of people did. I didn't know whether it was common knowledge or whether it wasn't. It's a sad story, and it wasn't of much interest to me.
What wasn't of much interest to you, Cardinal?
The suffering, of course, was real, and I very much regret that, but I had no reason to turn my mind to the extent of the evils that Ridsdale had perpetrated.
Did you hear the gasp from people in the audience
when he said it wasn't of concern to him, Ridsdale's crimes? Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I did hear the gasp. Yeah, and that's where you see that's the thug and the sociopath coming out. right? Sociopathic tendencies, let's say. I don't think he's a sociopath.
I mean, because sometimes I'm thinking, is he just a clod, or is he that disconnected?
Well, what do you do? He's caught. What do you do when you're caught? You're caught red-handed, right? You just sort of try to bluff your way out of it. What can you say? I'm guilty, and I'll go do a life of penance. That's not his style.
But I guess he could. I don't know. It was.
It's the habits of a lifetime. It's just this is his. This is how he's always operated, and not in. He's actually genuinely competent in absolute terms, but it's there are no longer really very competent people in the church as a rule, right? And actually, that's something that's necessary for a corrupt institution. You got to have, it has to be largely staffed with mediocrities to make the corruption work, right? So, I mean, he's not dumb, but he's not an evil genius. He isn't smart enough to think about how to get out of this awkward spot or have a clever reply.
He's just somebody that supplied the grease to make the church work. I hate to say it that way, but there are a lot of them. And because when I knew I was going to have this conversation with you, I started looking at the Pell case again, and I haven't done it in a long time, probably for over a year. And I came across that snippet, that video, and that audio. And then I also came across a picture from St. Patrick's Seminary. That's the seminary for the Archdiocese of San Francisco, where I live. And they have a Facebook page, and the header, everybody kind of knows what that is, at the top of the page. It was a picture of, I assume, well, I recognize some of the people. I assume it was the seminarians, the teachers and staff. I recognized Archbishop Corleone, and at the center of the picture was Cardinal Pell. And I was kind of like, wow. So this is who the church is holding up as an example to future priests. They are effed. And I'm not saying that against anybody, but the church is in itself.
Yeah.
That's a bad look. That's a bad look.
Oh, he's like a boxer who won't lie down, right? He's been in jail, he's back up punching. Too bad it's not for some good cause. But it's just that there's all these people who they want to believe, right? They don't want to face up to how bad it is. I'll tell you one story about how bad it was, prompted by the mention of St. Patrick's. So it used to be St. Patrick's Seminary in Manly, in the north of Sydney, where all the priests were trained. Now that in 1980s thereabouts, it became notorious as a place where all the seminarians are groomed into homosexuality and into sexual abuse of one kind or another. So I was talking about this with a couple of ordinary parishioners outside having coffee after Mass, about how bad that period was, and they said, "Oh, who's that guy? Who's the guy who was having sex with the minor son of one of the staff at Manly? It was Father David O'Hearn." And I thought, "Oh wow, that's pretty terrible."
Yeah.
So it took me like 50 minutes to find the name of this guy, David O'Hearn. Who's he? So I look him up, and he was then a parish priest in north of Sydney, Newcastle Maitland Diocese. So this guy is so notorious that you could just find out about him by asking at the coffee hour after Mass. He was still the parish priest. He's now been convicted of I don't know, dozens of offenses of sexual abuse of minors. And it's things are so bad in Australia. So I said Ballarat was basically a criminal organization. think Adelaide was like that, right? Was the Vicar General died of a heart attack in some sex club or something. It's Melbourne, there's a very large, was a very large pedophile element, against veto on things. Sydney was broken up into several dioceses. Parramatta in the east, the bishop, Bede Heather, was caught shredding all the documents. Unfortunately, they were still shredded. The current bishop there has just issued some sex education program for Catholic schools. It's basically an exercise in grooming, right? Vincent Long, I think his name is. Bede Heather, there is a barrister in Australia who really disliked him, and he hired a private investigator to father Heather around the bishop. And finally, he caught him. I think it was on Christmas Eve or something, coming out of the caravan of his girlfriend. I think it was a nun, and zipping up his fly. So the barrister got the information, and Heather then had to retire in haste. But I think he just retired at the north coast with his girlfriend and kept on appearing at. He may still be alive. Kept on appearing at Australian bishops' conferences. It's like, it's like something out of Barry Humphries, right? I don't know, Sir Les Patterson, Dame Edna Everidge, right? Vulgar Australian comedian. Sir Les Patterson is his Catholic character, and he is notably heterosexual. But aside from that, you can sort of see you could see some of these characters figuring this in Barry Humphries' skits.
It's kind of like one year that I went to the Los Angeles Religious Education Conference and Congress, and Cardinal Mahoney was one of the speakers, and I was like, clueless, bad luck. But I think the Catholic Church specializes in bad looks. It just I couldn't imagine being a survivor in that archdiocese, and the guy who was the mastermind in covering everything up is speaking. It's so bizarre.
Yeah. Well, look at the Pope, that's his. He actually has a bit of Pell's modus operandi. He finds a priest who he gets dirt on, preferably child sex abuse of minors, and then he promotes them because then he's his guy.
Like McCarrick, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a lesson to be drawn from this, which is that, okay, Pell, he's basically a man of ambition. If he could have got to the top by burning pedophiles at the stake, he would have done it.
No.
Right, but that's not how the system has been set up during his whole career.
I think it's still. I think silence still reigns because, I've left the Catholic Church, and one of the things that bugged me was the willingness of the laity, if it fit their particular, especially like liturgical preference, to cover up. And I think Pell, sort of fits that scenario, but there's just no heroes, especially among the hierarchy. I think there are some heroes among the priests that have been, I shouldn't say I know there's some heroes among just the priests that were on the front lines who've been demonized and brutalized and by their bishops because either they want to be a whistleblower or they've tried to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Like when that young man came to Pell in 1974 and told him, there are priests that have tried and you get squished, you get squashed.
And so what do you do? I mean, you got to come up with some suggestions. For Australia, I think that the only solution now is to go back to Bede Polding's idea, right? Because the diocesan priesthood and the episcopate, it's too corrupt, it's broken.
Awful.
Right? It's broken. no one is even thinking of ways to fix it, right? So I think the only people that actually have like a system that's now known to work are actually people like the traditional Benedictines with a traditional liturgy and the traditional rule, right? And those monastic rules were designed to be so hard that corrupt people wouldn't stick around. Right. And even, okay, so you have one meal a day, meat only on Sundays, hard physical labor every day, right? That doesn't even, like the temptations of the flesh under those conditions are sensibly attenuated. That's why you see in the Desert Fathers, who were extremely ascetical, the problems were sort of gluttony and avarice, right? Because you're thinking about food all the time. So I think if you,
but the
monasteries that are, and you're also in them for a long time, right? You can take someone in there for decades and sort of work on them to change them. You can't say, here's your 7 years of seminary and then go out in charge of a parish. That won't work any longer. So I think you had going a traditional monastic revival. That's the only idea that I can come up with to try to make the church work in Australia.
I agree, but the only problem that I have with that is Catholicism is a top-down organization. So if you have a revival, let's say at the bottom of the pyramid, you know, among monks, there's still somebody over them that's corrupt.
Well,
sorry.
That's in practice has been true since the 19th century. I mean, if you look at the foundations of the religious orders, someone came along and they often got, say, who was telling the monks in Ireland whether or not they could find monasteries, right? Maybe the chaos is going to get so great that that effective central control isn't going to be possible to be exercised.
Okay. I have a question for you. Feel free not to answer, it's personal, but how have you been able to keep your faith? I mean, because I couldn't, because I kind of always think of Rod Dreher, somebody who's really just been in the swamp. Just it's difficult to keep your faith in this institution that is so horrible. So,
well, I suppose grace is the ultimate explanation, but there's natural features that help. So I'm a convert, right?
Wow. Okay.
And I'm a convert, and I'm a I'm an academic, and much when it comes to the church, sort of my mental world and my conception of it is formed basically by the books that I've read. I mean, I didn't know any Catholics until I converted. I just walked into the university chaplaincy. So, and I guess I did quite a lot of patristics and medieval study at university. So my mental world of the Catholics is of Catholicism is based on what I read. It's not on the somewhat inadequate inadequate figures that I just mean. I don't know. So all these people are corrupt mediocrities and liars and don't believe any of it. Well, yeah, they're just that's just I don't know. It doesn't seem to sort of strike my faith that strongly. I don't know. I mean, it does seem how. Oh, here's my. I wrote a book about it, Divine Faith. So it's on why the rational basis of Christian belief, which ends up being something like the rational basis of Catholic belief.
You're, if I can put words in your mouth, or this is my assessment, is that you're an intellectual guy, and you can separate the corrupt leadership from the institution. See, if for someone like me, and others, because most survivors that I know, they don't necessarily leave Christianity, but they leave the Catholic Church. It's difficult when you're dealing with all these people who represent the church. And then, because like in Catholicism, we're taught in persona Christi, and the Pope is the vicar of Christ. So these people represent the church. And when they are acting so you know, in such a disgusting manner, it's difficult to trust or to have any faith in the institution when its representatives are so corrupt. So
Well, I says two things. One is I was never abused by him, right? That's a completely different level of
yeah,
trauma.
I know.
And the other is, I guess because my conception of what it is to be a Catholic and a priest Catholic is formed by study, right? When I see these characters, I cease to take them seriously as Catholics, right? I don't see them like someone like that religious education thing in Los Angeles. They're just, I don't take those people seriously as Catholics. They're just really corrupt, mediocre, wannabe liberal Protestants.
I want to be James Martin. But the thing
Yeah.
that, and I used to think that too, until I want to let you go because you've given me enough time. I used to have that pretty much the same mindset until I started going to them. And I said, well, we've got CCD teachers, we've got DREs, we've got sisters, we've got priests, we've got parochial school teachers, all there. And they hear all this garbage, and then they go back to their diocese and spew it out. So it's serious. It's a problem. And again, it goes back. We're talking about that's a cardinal there, or no, he's not Gomez, Archbishop, but still, it's a failure of leadership. So
yes, yeah. Well, what can I say? I guess that's what I have to say about Cardinal Pell and the state of the world and the church and all that stuff. So
thank you. I hope that Catholics listen to this with an open mind, do some reading, because I think there's a narrative that's been spun about Cardinal Pell, and I don't think it's the truth. I think there's a truth here that needs to be heard, and I don't know about his journals, whether they're spiritual classics or not, but certainly that
it's not logically impossible that they're spiritual classics. And prison does a lot of people good. Maybe he hasn't come out and said I'm sorry for all the bad things I've done.
Exactly.
I know of. Yeah.
And I want to get your response to one last thing, because one of the things that really concerned me about Pell and just a lot of the hierarchy is judgment. And I talked about this with you. I think there's a lack of judgment there. And I think because I'm a survivor myself, I think after his release from prison, I think the sensitive thing to do would have been to lay low. It was like, okay,
just go on his own.
Out of respect for the people of Ballarat or the victims of Ridsdale, anybody, let's just lay low. That's not what he did. That's not what he did.
Why didn't he just go to the beach house he inherited from his mother and just
No, he did a media blitz.
Yeah. But I mean, how do you change your spots when you're over 80, right? He's what he is.
Okay. It's again, it's a bad look, and it's clueless to me.
Yeah. And he built a very expensive, luxurious pad for himself in Rome. Like, he's probably there right now, right? Why doesn't he just enjoy the Roman scene and
I don't know.
And not bother with But I mean, that's been his whole life. It's been his whole life. It's hard to change those habits.
Okay, and he does have his followers, so I guess that's what they want. That's what they wanted. They wanted him to do a victory march.
Yeah.
So, but I think it was whatever the truth of his case was that was overturned. I think that doesn't undo what happened before, and
No.
No,
and I think he was completely innocent, right? So, and it was a terrible, it was a terrible, and I don't think he was, these abusive characters, just abusing one person for them, I would think is like eating one potato chip, right? I would think if he'd had a career as an abuser, there'd have been more smoke. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are abused people out there, but I think he's basically a man of power and ambition.
Yeah.
And that's what led him. And that's maybe the lesson to take away from him. That's what led him to do the things that he did. And that's not what we need in the church.
No. Hey, God bless you, John. Thank you for
Oh, no,
dedicating.
thanks. This was excellent. Thanks for listening to me rant on.
No, thank you so much. I hope people look into this more.
Yeah.
With eyes wide open. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, John. God bless you. Yeah. Maybe next time we could do something on the SSPX.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yes. Okay.
God bless you.
All right, great.